Welcome to Psychologist Talks. Today we're going to be talking about absolutism versus relativism. This is going to be a more existential episode, talking very holistically about this concept, this push and pull, the vacillation between these two forces that is so central, in my opinion, to our existence. I'm not going to be applying it to the mental health field or the field of psychology. I think absolutely could, but just that's going to have to be another episode if I make another episode about application to our field, my field. So again, we're talking more global here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to define it first, talk a little bit about why we have this struggle, and then use some examples for that struggle. And at the end, I'll offer some guidance. Guidance might be a strong word, but just, what are we supposed to do with this? This is all well and good. So, from a psychological point of view, what are we supposed to do about this? Try my best. Now, full disclosure, I am not a philosopher by trade, and if you have studied philosophy, you're probably sitting here rolling your eyes and going like, oh gosh, I've heard this 1,000 times before. My apologies. I'm probably going to scratch the surface. I'm aware that I have a spouse who studied philosophy. I am sure she can run circles around me about this, but I arrived upon this understanding through my experiences, but then also my training in the field of psychology. So there's absolutely intersections with philosophy and psychology, but this is stemming from the experiences I have had working with people and systems. And so for whatever that's worth, I'll offer my thoughts on it, and we'll see how it goes. And if you're a philosopher by trade, you can tell me how bad or how poorly I did with it. So trying to define it. So I'll try to keep it in simple terms because I think it's just easier and it makes it a little bit more accessible. Absolutism, as I understand it, is this sort of desire for us to, and I think it's important to name it as a desire. It's a desire for us to approach a singular truth, something that we can hold in the palm of our hand, something that's concrete, something that is simple and universal enough that we can surround ourselves with a lot of people and we can all say, are we seeing this the same way? Am I seeing it the same way you're seeing it? We can say yes. Relativism, on the other hand, is that there is no singular truth, that there are multiple truths out there. And the reason for this is that everybody's experience is kind of saturated with context. And with that, you cannot arrive upon a singular truth. There are endless truths out there. The world is endlessly relative. And so these two forces are antithetical to each other this is the fun part with semantics, in their absolute form, which might make it sound like I'm arguing for relativism, but I promise I'm going to make a case for both sides. But this idea is like there is no truth and there is a singular truth. At its core is, I think, one of the dilemmas that we grapple with as human beings, and this is really, really important. And natural. And that's why I think we need to understand this as human beings. We really need to understand that these forces live inside of all of us. You cannot escape it. I promise you, you are dealing with this dilemma. The more conscious we are of the dilemma, the better we can wield and move through it efficiently. So speaking of, why would we have these forces inside of us? Because we vacillate. The argument that I should make before I say why is that we vacillate between these. And some people might be more absolute in one area and more relative in another. But one way or another, some of us lean more towards, absolutism, others more towards relativism. And there are those of us who really try to float in the middle. But even then, it's a struggle. So what is with this vacillation? Why are we doing that? Like, why would we be pulled between these two different directions? Well, the way I see it is, again, they serve a psychological purpose for us. And the simplest way I can say it is, within absolutism, I'm forgetting which hand I use, I think I said this hand. Within absolutism lies safety. Within relativism lies freedom. And so we'll start with absolutism, talking a little bit about this safety. But what it's doing for us is it provides a sense of something tangible, not necessarily literally tangible, but something that we can hold on to. And when we can say that something is predictable, when we say that we can always return back to this idea, this foundational principle, this truth, it provides us a sense of safety because the world is a scary and unpredictable place, and that absolute or at least the approximation of an absolute, gives us something really important. And societies do not form. They cannot form without some degree of absolutism, without us surrounding something really tangible that we all agree upon. The problem, though, again, is that with that safety comes a narrowing of vision that can be suffocating and so confining that we then need to push for greater freedoms, because that within that freedom provides a greater possible next step, a greater truth, something that we can arrive upon. But again, notice how there is, stealing from Eastern philosophy. Again, there's a lot of what we do. I shouldn't say stealing. It's just, borrowing from the wisdom of the many that came before us. They exist in tandem. There is a yin and a yang between them. They are interdependent upon one another. That to get to truths in our life, we have to grapple with relativism. And then, we don't stay in relativism too long, because then we need to move our way back to a truth. And so we find ourselves moving predictably. Some people find themselves very nihilistic about this. Well, it never ends. We never find our way to a truth. It's exhausting. It's stupid. We just, we're repeating our same mistakes over and over again. And I would say, well, I'm a bit of a cynic and pessimist myself, but I wouldn't necessarily agree. There's something actually quite beautiful about that. And what we're trying to do is approximate and build upon prior truths so we can expand our scope, but then effectively consolidate around those newer truths. And that's hard to do as a society, to get everyone to kind of commonly understand more complex and more abstract ideas, so we're not thinking in such absolute ways. So even absolutism in the present day is steeped in relativism of the past. It's all kind of relative. That's where the semantic, the words get a little bit fun. It's all relative based on time. And I say that to try to instill some hope. Is like this vacillation between these, as we go through time, ideally gets a little bit less and less stark, because we're learning, we're building. It's not to say that we aren't self-destructing and reversing time sometimes, because we absolutely do. You see my episode on change over time. There's absolutely self-destruction in society. But holistically, using the language from that episode, if we're sufficiently stitching, then these vacillations are leading us towards more robust, more kind of like flexible versions of objective truths. And that's like certainly something we should aspire to. So again, they play off of one another. But again, they're universally important. Safety is important to everyone. A sense of freedom is important to everyone. It just varies on where people land. So let's kind of illustrate the points here of like, so some of y'all might be picking up what I'm putting down already, but let's go through this and say, okay, so let's give some ideas of or some examples of absolutes and what we're grounding ourselves in. So really obvious one to most folks are laws. Well, let's go with rules, because laws are kind of a result of rules. And when we form together, we need to have a common set of principles and rules, so that we have an idea of like, okay, this is sanctioned and this is unsanctioned, because otherwise I can't predict what you're going to do. Murder and theft are two very clear examples that I think most people intrinsically understand. You can go to any country, any civilization, and usually that's going to be the case. You don't murder people and you don't steal from each other. But it's really interesting to kind of convince you of my point that there's always a struggle, is that even within the absolutes in our world, there's relativism bleeds its way in. And you will hear, as when I get to relativism, absolutism bleeds its way into relativism. And isn't that kind of a beautiful thing? There's always an offsetting force, even if we're more in one realm than the other. And laws are just, they're more absolute. But you can very quickly come up with reasons why murder, well, we don't always call it murder, but we start naming it something different. But why killing another human being could be technically sanctioned. Self-defense, anything where someone is being treaded upon. We talk about wars. We talk about, defending loved ones, those sorts of things. Well, suddenly relativism creeps in a little bit. But again, by and large, no, we don't. We don't want to kill each other. Theft. It's a very famous moral dilemma that we talk about in the field of psychology, is like a life-saving medication, and what happens if someone can't afford it. This kind of moral dilemma. Someone can't afford it. Is it okay to steal that medication if they go through all the means and methods that they can to procure it, but they can't, and they have to choose between stealing and letting a loved one die? Does that make stealing okay? Right? So relativism creeps in just a smidge. But there are other institutions in this world that absolutism surrounds. Now I'm going to borrow sort of something that my spouse reflected to me, and I've kind of taken and run with it. And this might sound dicey to some folks depending on their experiences with religion, but it's not meant to be religious. I think just the word illustrates my point. And the idea with it when we're talking about absolutes is that we're all looking for something to worship. We're looking for something, again, concrete, something that we can ground ourselves in, a set of principles, a way of seeing and understanding the world that is accessible to us and gives us a sense of order. And so laws are one. You know, it's a tainted term these days, but law and order, right? Like, you know, do you worship law and order? Well, no one's going to say that they do, but you have a varying degree of like how much people really solidify themselves around that or not. Religion, another really interesting example in this domain, because, I mean, now granted worship is part and parcel to this, but even within religion, it's really interesting because there are a bunch of different religions out there. But isn't it really interesting, if you think of it from like a comparative religion standpoint, that these common threads or these common universals that are often woven between the religions? And that's probably because it's serving some sort of purpose. Now, I'm not trying to sound agnostic about this, but I'm trying to be respectful of like, how can we understand psychologically a bunch of human beings organizing around a bunch of different religions, and yet still somehow they have these central truths? Again, not trying to make an argument for right or wrong, just throwing it out there. And yet there is this variance. Relativism creeps its way in, because that's what us human beings do when we wield things. We just grapple with these tendencies. And why can you go to one church and they can be more absolute in their belief, and you go to another and they're far more relative in how they wield those beliefs? Human nature. Let's go to another one that's real fun, science. So some people are like, I don't worship science. Do you not? It depends. Because science gives us a sense of principles about how the world operates. And if we don't have those common sets of principles, then the world, again, is this dangerous place, and we give over all of our beliefs to many gods, right? You know, it's no coincidence that way back religions first began with the many gods to explain phenomenon around us. Isn't that interesting? So science gives us this sense of like predictability about the world. Now, science is kind of interesting because it's been challenged a little bit more recently. I think science always has a place, but you will inherently, when you talk to people, have varying degrees to which people anchor themselves in science versus something else. So, you know, this is kind of the dilemma is, well, let me pause and say, notice though that relativism is baked into science. And I'm not saying like you can't trust science. Just if you talk to a good scientist, they will tell you that we're always trying to approximate truth. That's just how it works. Like even the laws of physics, there are really smart physicists out there go like, yeah, and there might be something extra out there too, right? So we're always trying to like evolve and understand that within any truth that we try to ground ourselves in when it comes to science, there's always the possibility that we didn't quite get it right. And that's, to me, very exciting and very cool. But then even relativism bleeds its way into something that we like to think is very absolute. But again, people have different relationships with science. Some people are the absolute law, it's the way it is. I'm going to speak everything like it's a pure fact. Other folks go, yeah, that's how we understand it right now. And really, we need to anchor in this because could we be wrong? Well, there's always, you know, when we talk about confidence intervals in research, like there's always the possibility we could be wrong. But when enough stuff replicates and says this is probably going on, let's at least listen to it for now and let's keep studying it just to be safe and make sure we didn't mess it up. That doesn't mean you abandon it, right? But it's a similar, you could argue a similar dilemma with religion, which gets bad rap. Which remember, it's not necessarily the institutions that we look towards that are bad. It's how human beings encounter them and wield them that causes us trouble. So even religion, it's like, well, it's it causes a lot of harm. It's like, well, just like science, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Might there be ways, and might we respect that there are people who really encounter their religions, and it's absolutely important. It provides really foundational truths through which they live their lives, and they become functioning and important members of society, much like people who tend more towards science, or much more people who are all about kind of law and order and tending to the politics of a society. We all have our things that we tend to invest most of our energies into, and that's okay. It's the beauty of absolutes, is we find ways to find common truths around which societies can form. And they become more and more complex over time, which is part of the challenge. Now, here's where relativism enters the fray. So we have this native tendency, and this is really interesting because it mirrors to me a learning principle that we always start with the, as I say always, in an absolute fashion. To me, we have to start with concrete absolutes. It's how we learn. We learn abstraction by grounding ourselves in something really singular. And then as we kind of flirt with and figure our way through the absolutes, inevitably we will find something relative that is missing. And so when we go back to kind of the lurches of society, relativism serves as an important counterbalancing force because absolutism is inherently going to be too narrow. Especially the more and more connected we are as a society, there are a ton of truths out there. And so as we kind of understand the varying perspectives and varying experiences, we have to reapproach absolutism and say, no, hold on. We need to start embracing relativism and challenging the central truth. Now, remember what I said earlier, it's not for the abandonment of that singular truth, because invariably as human beings, we're going to want to find our way back to some sort of central truth, but we need to find agreeance about it first. And the only way you do that is through embracing relativism and challenging the norms, and thus the vacillation occurs. So what are we grappling with in the world of relativism? Well, some of the institutions I just talked about, we are challenging how we are wielding them. Now, I'm not in agreement with like throwing babies out with bathwater. That's not necessarily a good way to go about things. But that's different than like fundamentally challenging. So take like the civil rights movement. It was about like society is not working for a lot of us. And so we need to work towards equity. That is not them, that's not the civil rights movement saying like, so we're throwing out society. Like, we're deconstructing a system in a way, but it's to build a greater truth that is more inclusive in the process. So we're challenging the truth that is, which is scary. Remember, safety comes with absolutism. And so we're going to have to deal with this, the fear that just naturally occurs when we start dealing with the freedoms that come with relativism. We're not sure where we're landing. We have to let go of that safety bar and float for a little bit so we can embrace and really encounter this relativism, and we will find our way back to something that feels solid again. But people really have a hard time with that. So what are the ones that we're addressing right now? Well, there's multiples, but you might sit here, and this is an interesting projective exercise. If you're sitting here thinking about absolutism and relativism, and then you add politics to it, who do you think is being absolute and who do you think is being relativistic? This is always interesting, because the point of this is not to make it political. The point is that everybody on any end of the aisle, and I say any end of the aisle in case I get somebody from another country that has more than two aisles, heaven forbid, it's a human construct. And so it doesn't matter where you land politically, you are practicing this more or less than you might know. And so it's I'll kind of give away my sentiment is I think relativism often is associated with like left-leaning, progressive, socially progressive stuff, and it is in many ways. But you will find relativism everywhere. And if I remember as I'm talking, I'll go through this example. So let's go through the more common ones, the more predictable ones of like gender and race and capitalism, right? Law and order, like what constitutes a good sense of law and order. These are being grappled with right now. And so I think that's why there's so much fear and so much fight, because relativism has just come in like a 10-ton truck here, and it's just all over the place. And some people are kind of cautious about it, like I don't know, I don't know. Other people are all about it, and others are like, whoa, 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 no, 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 thank you. Like, no, this is too scary. This is too much. Or I'll do this one, but I can't do all these, because it just doesn't have that sense of safety of like, this is the common truth. I thought this was the way. Now you're telling me it's not the way. This is exhausting. This is terrifying. And understand that within relativism is a degree of, because it depends on how people wield it, is that relativism can be way too relative, that it is a sort of like, not just I want to like challenge the system so it's more robust. It can feel like it wants to utterly destroy and never let it reconstruct again. And most people I don't think are that way, but I think that's what fear does to people, is like, oh no, they're looking to destroy it and nothing will exist anymore. Much like, oh no, people are looking for a singular truth and that way I will cease to exist. My identity will never be respected. And it's like, those do exist, but how are we trying to find our way towards the middle? So trying to get back to the point. Sorry, my mind is very expansive. Let's take race, for example. Very charged, very challenging. Race back in the day, racism, we tended to, I say we, I think white individuals grappled with for a while that, whether or not I was not alive during this time, but grappled with like equity and treating, one another with respect. And so we eventually came to a point where we recognized that the inequity was there. But then we did this really interesting thing where when we moved from this relativism of like, oh, we need to grapple with this issue, when we found our way back towards absolutism, we did this like approximation. We did this like, well, and it was never said, is this like, well, we've moved through the civil rights movement, so we realized that the racism is real, and then it was very, very quick to be like, and now we've solved that problem, which is short-sighted, right? It was not actually embracing the more relativistic components of racism, which, and when I talk to people, it's like, you're not talking just about racism, you're talking about the natural tendency of the human brain and what it does with difference. Like, if you think it's just about racism, it's like, guess what? Anytime you experience anything of difference in your life, you gotta watch yourself, because the brain does not so good things with difference. And so you really need to be conscious of this. So I try to assuage people's anxieties and guilt around this of like, it's a serious issue. You gotta, really dive deep. But if you think it's like something that's like you're a good person or a bad person, it's like, no, you're fighting against inner tendencies, and you really need to be mindful of that. And if you're going to be a steward of good, positive society, you got to figure out how to do this. Take it as a challenge that makes you a more robust, more flexible human being. So we have the civil rights movement, and then we find ourselves hitting racism again. Not that it was any surprise, right? But for whatever reason, George Floyd was this like boiling over moment of something that was already there. And it's like, no, there's next level stuff we got to talk about. And so here we get this reaction of like, I thought we were done with this. I had the absolute, I thought we were past this, and a lot of people are afraid of it. Yet there are other folks who are at least willing to go like, there is something a little bit off kilter still. Maybe we should listen to this. And then, of course, there's lots of folks embracing it fully, going, yeah, we got to keep pushing on this. Like, we still have some work to do. And this is that sort of relativistic push. But again, there's a lot of people that are really scared, and so there's a warring of the factions right now. And sadly, many abstainers that are like, oh, I'm putting my foot into this battle. This is very confusing. Which abstainers can be dangerous. We talked about in the Change Over Time episode. Now let's use an example that might be on the other side of the aisle here in the States, just to illustrate that this is not a political thing. This is a human thing. It's just a human nature to do this. So let's talk about the deep state. And so here is this, what was once an embracing of an absolute, the laws and the order and the institutions that are going to protect us. Now, do understand there's always been a little bit of variance over this when we talk about like, well, states' rights versus, federal rights, I'm not sure how familiar folks from other countries might be of this, but this whole idea of like, you've got the United States government, and then each state has its own government, and there's a power balance between those two, who gets the most power. Now, what I'm trying to say is, like, if you think right-leaning is all pro-government, it's not necessarily that. But there was a common belief in these institutions. And because of, I'm just going to say it frankly, because of people engaging in psychological warfare on the country, and I do not say that lightly, there is a sudden challenging, not just like, maybe we need to take another look at this, like the relativism of like, maybe there's corruption, maybe maybe we need to look into things and be more careful. We have a sudden shift into, they are not to be trusted. These entities are, should be dissolved. There is no good that comes to them. Now, again, I'm not saying everybody believes this, but this is the interesting experience of relativism. That once was a common truth, that our government agencies, while sometimes, excessive spending and sometimes getting in their business too much, they are good entities. They are important entities to make sure that chaos does not unfold. Now feels very much like they are the chaos. They are the reason why everything is falling apart. And here, relativism enters the fray again. There is no singular truth. There is only this sort of amorphous deep state problem that we need to eradicate. And it's starting to take hold of something that goes towards relativism that could be productive into relativism that is quite dangerous, and there is no truth left. So this is the beauty of the system. I know it's a weird thing for me to follow, but like follow just talking about like deep state conversations. Like we are all pulled between these forces. And it's beautiful because that's how progress happens. The challenge is, how do we discern between these vacillations that are productive versus more unproductive? And it is very tough for us to do. It often happens in hindsight, right? We look at what came and we're like, that was a good one. Other times we look back and like, ooh, what were we thinking? So this is the challenge that is in front of us. Ideally, when we have responsible stewards in positions of leadership, and these are folks that are usually better at balance, not like unapologetic, like I'm always in the gray, because the gray does not exist. We're always going to lean one way or another. But when we're flexible, we can find people in positions of power, and we elect and put people in, and not just politics, but any position of power. When we get people in there who are more flexible with this, they're willing to lean when you have to lean into conflict for change, but they're willing to find a balance and kind of a marrying force. They're really effective stewards of change to try to mitigate us overcorrecting and making too many like harsh mistakes to just, live out these self-destructive fantasies. And so it is, I don't think I have necessarily an easy answer for us. I think one of the things I usually say is social progress is usually not for ill. When we talk about like giving someone extra rights or accessibility in balance, not like switching the hands of power, like that's not the point. When we talk about actual equity, it's usually a relatively good thing. I mean, you look back at history, it's like, when has a lot of ill been done? Usually to suppress or sequester or disempower a certain group of people. When has good usually happened and countries are created and become quite powerful? Usually when we try, don't always succeed, but we really try to espouse the value of equity, and everybody has an opportunity. So I think that's somewhat of a reasonable good rule of thumb, but there's harder things out there to debate. And what I encourage folks towards is to first start with like some self-assessment. It's what we do in our profession. Like, we have to know what we call countertransference to the people that we work with, because we have to understand what's coming up for us and what do we own on. It's us. It's about us and not about the person we're meeting with, versus what's like a legitimate reaction or interaction that we can process and play with, because I don't need to be putting my stuff on other people. And so the self-reflective process, while challenging, could be a really helpful first step if you're not already doing it. So the challenge is if you evaluate your life, and I often say, like, don't just evaluate yourself, have other people evaluate you too, assuming that they're willing to tell you and assuming you're not engaging in a bunch of groupthink of just a bunch of people who are just like you. You're like, I don't know what you're talking about, but I say it with a grain of salt. But by and large, a good task is to self-reflect and if you have reasonable people around you. I mean, heck, even people who you have conflict with might be a good individual to go to and ask this if you have that type of relationship. If you lean more on the absolute side, then the question is, why? And just be curious, because the theory today is that there is a sense of safety and security and predictability in it. And if you lean more towards relativism, why? Well, there's a sense of freedom and relativity and flexibility in it. And once you kind of get curious about the why, the next thing you could do is like, what can I borrow from the opposite side? How can I challenge myself in my relativism to look at the other side and go, how can I understand the benefits of absolutism? And I'm sure I can find some in my life when I'm pulled towards central truths and singular truths, things that are safe and tangible. And vice versa, if I'm more on the absolute side, is there something I can appreciate and understand the benefit of relativism through my own personal history, my own experiences, to maybe something I can't quite see? Because this is to me, kind of comes back to did I make that point already? One of my central points is like, the balance only exists in relation to the extremes. And so if we find ourselves leaning more one way, why not borrow from the other? And the easiest way to do that, because we can't be jack of all trades. Again, ideally leaders can flex and pull from both, people in positions of power, but use each other. The more absolute people in my world are really important to me because they keep me grounded. I don't always agree with them. I sometimes push against them very hard. Because, again, with absolutism can come suffocating forces. You'll hear this probably in my channel and across my episodes, that I tend to live more in the world of relativism than anywhere. But that doesn't mean it's like the right way. People will frequently challenge me to funnel it towards some sort of truth, something that's more graspable, because if it's just endless relativism, it's hard to attach ourselves to anything. And so folks who think more in the absolute and just the position in of itself is something I have to tend to and remind myself and pull myself back towards. And again, vice versa, is that the relativistic folks in this world are really important because they're reminding us of what freedom is. They're reminding us of what thinking divergently might be, or what that might look like. And we have to entertain that for the purposes of progress. We need each other in that. We need these counterbalancing forces. There will be uncomfortable times, such as I would argue in the present day, where we're not really leaning on each other very well, but we're both pulling in really important directions. That the relativism is arguments for freedom that a lot of people need. And the absolutism, again, I'm not saying it's all good, all bad on either side, but the absolutism also pulls us towards, and how do we still ground ourselves in something central? But again, ultimately, how are we marrying those two forces and not just shifting between those extremes? Right now, we're having a hard time finding balance. We're anchoring, I think, a little bit in too much in the extremes. So how are we going to, come back to a sense of balance and using one another for good? So I think that's about it. It's a dicey conversation. Hopefully I didn't tick anybody off too much. It's just to me a really fascinating and just really interesting aspect of us as human beings. And I think the more we, just spend a little bit of time thinking about these pools inside of us, I think the better we will operate. So I hope it has been curiosity provoking to some degree, and encourages some degree of self-reflection, and maybe even provides a little bit of an explanation of why we do what we do in society over the decades, of why we find ourselves moving between what could look like extremes, but to me is that there's a dance happening there. It is the inevitable process towards finding balance. How do we move between safety and freedom? How do we move between the forces of absolutism and relativism? All right, again, thanks so much, and stay curious.